Thank you, everyone, for having me tonight, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to read a new story tonight called Bedrock. If she hadn't been reading about lunar rabbit holes in Scientific American when she landed in Buffalo for the winter conference, and about what it would be like to go all the way down one, screaming through tunnels of ancient lava ash until she hit moon bottom like an elevator cut from its core, she might have made a different decision. But she had signed up for the conference to do something, to stick a fork into the ambient boredom of audio sales and quotas and meat-free Monday and takeout Tuesday, and had she not noticed, she matched a blue sock to black. She'd sat on a rock by a shallow river once, watching a crayfish eat a bluegill, eyeballs and all. The bluegill hadn't even put up a fight if you didn't count its tail flapping an adagio beat while the rest of its body was devoured. It had to have been near dead when the crayfish started in on it, because what else accounted for the complacency? She couldn't remember blinking when he looked at her with that question, "Come up to my room?" She wondered, lugging her suitcase through the terminal when she returned to California, weary, which metaphor better suited her, the lunar hole plunge or the crayfish. All she knew for sure was that an action potential with feather-fined dendritic roots was always trying to grow into or overtake whatever was nearest and weaker by degrees, e.g. the lava through moon rock, e.g. the crayfish and the bluegill, e.g. him and her. She believed in biology, gravity, instinct, necessity, convenience, survival. She did not believe in serendipity or fate, not anymore. From her laptop whirring heat against the hotel desk, conductivity, thermodynamics, she would have to consider those metaphors too. She arranged to meet him in the auditorium at 4 in the afternoon. Perfect because it wouldn't obligate her to share a meal or drink with him if they didn't hit it off. Perfect because it left those options open. The room was full of blue chairs, empty until the keynote address later that night, save for the stray conference attendee popping in to make a call or sip bottled water. It was a poor rendezvous site, suggesting neither potential nor hope of fulfillment. Waiting for him, she watched a man cower in the corner, blowing thin white puffs at the wall after each drag of his electronic cigarette. She had to applaud his attempt to quit. Why hide, though? A man walked toward her. She cataloged his suit, gray in winter. Could that mean something particular? She thought not, and wiped her palm against the side stitching of her polyester pants, extending it on key. They shook hands. Let him know you're his equal, she thought as she mashed her lips together. It was a habit she had when leading men in sales, something her mother had taught her when she started in the industry after failing her MCATs twice. You have to let these men know you won't take any of their bullshit, her mother said, but also keep it so they'll do what you want when the time comes. Are you cut out for that? The answer hadn't mattered because hers was a job of last resort, and so it went. A wet lip when she needed it, a mouth closed when she didn't. It was a balancing act whose axis was suggestion, human at its core. She hoped that she wouldn't have to rely on it because she was smart and capable, but people were funny, and it had turned out to be the only true skill her job required, beyond regurgitation of numbers and pressing send on an email. It made her happy she'd never had a daughter of her own. Wrinkles around the man's eyes upturned, highlighting brown irises where she had wanted blue. Her lanyard caught on a button and tugged the fabric of her shirt apart from the buttonhole, securing its two edges over her breasts. He seemed to notice, peripherally, so she dropped his hand and straightened her back. "Good to meet you finally," he said. "Put a face to the name, you know." She knew. They had exchanged many emails prior to this face-to-face meeting, mostly work-related but friendly. Jokes and smiley faces. "Hey, got something for you. Insert wrapped gift emoji. Just kidding, but hey, here are those specs you needed." Now there was enough moisture at the corners of his mouth to make her think, well, this could be something. A lunar rabbit hole maybe. A fork into the topsoil at least. Later at a dinner party comprised mostly of people neither of them had known before that day, all buying or selling products to and from each other, or learning how to better buy and sell products to and from each other, and hoping they were each the very best at buying and selling products to and from each other. They found themselves seated together at the end of a long table. "You aren't what I was expecting," he said loudly, in the pause between 90s pop songs. She giggled, popped on Chardonnay, She thought for a second that he'd been talking to someone else or himself, but there he was, unflinching. She'd have preferred if he'd said who rather than what. He smiled and leaned back in his chair, his knee falling against hers. They made no effort to move. She pressed her lips. How so? She asked. He shrugged. Just different, I guess, funnier, smarter, etc. She excused herself to the restroom, slightly shaken, but hating to take her knee from his. It had grown warm there, and as she walked away, a vacancy spread across her kneecap. Patella plateaued, she thought, and looked down, making sure she'd lost his warmth and not her whole leg. In the ladies' room, she checked her phone. Nothing. She watched her face in the mirror and wondered how old she looked. 40? Less than? What did etc. mean, and what had he been expecting? Someone younger and not so charming from the sounds of it. She'd have to be wittier in future emails. And how old was he anyway? She guessed they were about the same age. He was shorter than she'd imagined, but she liked the way he listened. She found she sounded more interesting than she'd given herself credit for, and he had pointed out, as people often did, that she didn't seem suited to sales, intellectually speaking. But it wasn't a compliment so much as a reminder of her failed entry into another profession. Susie returned from the restroom to find Mark standing outside in the snow without a coat, talking on his phone. She watched him in pantomime, gesturing with his free hand as he spoke to someone in another part of his life, someone in Minneapolis. Minneapolis, Mark sells microphones to Sacramento Susie. She liked the sound of that and smiled at him through the window. He smiled back. One cheek gathered in a pointed dimple, one not, which could have meant, sorry, had to take this, or sorry, I'm telling my daughter good night, or sorry, I'm telling my wife I'm getting into the elevator, about to head up to my room. These meetings are always the worst. Wish I were home. The only thing she could tell from where she stood was that his whitened teeth held a lie and his eyes held honesty. She was just glad she wasn't the one on the other end of the phone. When he came back inside, she brushed snow from his shoulders and wiped a few flakes from his nose. It was more motherly than flirtatious, but he seemed happy to let her do it. You look like you just walked out of a snow globe, she said. He leaned in to ask the inevitable question. She was surprised at how quickly she'd said yes. She'd fantasized about a moment like this, which hadn't been presented to her in ages, but in her mind she always said no, leaving both parties painfully unsatisfied. He had to use the bathroom first, so she waited near the entrance of the combination restaurant bar, hoping their dinner mates were too busy deceiving themselves with spirits and misappropriated overhead lighting to see them leave together. They slurred and hooted at one another in the distance. No, they wouldn't notice a damn thing. But when another minute passed, she was sure Mark had changed his mind. Still, she waited. She should have taken a picture with him, she thought, maybe pretending she was a person that became silly and sentimental when she drank. It would be nice to have a picture she could glance at alongside to-do lists and call lists, but it would come out lopsided, him looking gorgeous though imperfectly dimpled and her bleary-eyed and vampy. It would become a kind of story with gaping hollows where she had hole-punched out the truth. A face where there ought to be a name, lust where there ought to be love. No, a photo wouldn't be good at all. Finally, Mark joined her, taking her by the hand. The elevator ride to the 6th floor was too bright and too long, but then, behind the door of room 621, an electric pulse fired information from here to there. Here was her elbow, there was his fingertip, here was her navel, there was his mouth. Here was certainty, there was uncertainty, here was the crayfish, there was the bluegill. Here was the lunar bedrock, which was what she'd wanted after all. She lay in his mouth, claw-pinned for a kill, tail flapping. Afterwards, she stood at the window and looked out, sweat pooling in a slow drip down the line of her back. Snow-covered Buffalo streets. Icy water in the distance flickered with muted reflections of the city's lights, bright pings of auto headlights distorting everything. He lay in the bed, covered by a white sheet. Their phones buzzed on opposite nightstands. They looked at them and then at each other. He said to her, "Stay." She went limp, crimpled, quietly elated. She was eaten whole and barely swimming. In the morning, she touched his collarbones, then his cheekbones while he slept. She looked at the time and cursed, scrambling to gather her things. She returned to her room 2 floors down. Stuffing clothes and shoes into her suitcase, she made a quick cup of coffee, her head throbbing. She rode the elevator down to the lobby, images of him swirling, and rushed to the hotel van that would take her to the airport, hoping she hadn't missed it. Mark, wearing a gray suit from the night before, was climbing into the van. She followed him and sat next to him. "Morning," she whispered. He looked how she felt. He nodded. This time their knees didn't touch. Susie looked in earnest for a sunrise, but it was too early and too wintry for anything but darkness. She needed to eat or throw up, or both. At the airport, they navigated the security line together, chunking ahead one slow step at a time. After passing through the body scan machine, they sat side by side on a bench to put their shoes on. She stood to say goodbye, trying to drum up some kindly parting words despite her hangover, and he met her with an awkward hug and a mumbled phrase. They turned and walked toward separate terminals to board flights to Minneapolis and Sacramento. Susie stopped in the restroom and threw up, wiped her mouth with toilet paper. She brought a low-fat blueberry muffin and choked it down. Somewhere over Colorado, a clock began ticking in her mind. A week passed. She stared at her inbox while she made calls to clients. She drank more coffee than usual and ate less. She fidgeted. Finally, his name appeared on the screen, but he wrote only of work. She gagged and added a postscript to her reply that read, "Wish we were back in the snow globe." Deleted it, retyped it, hit send. He didn't email her back. That night, she nursed 2 separate disappointments with the same wine, in silence, willfully pairing blue socks with black. In another week, a new contact at Mark's company was assigned to her. She went to the women's restroom and locked herself inside a stall. Crying noiselessly with one hand across her mouth, she sunk to the floor until she was eye level with the toilet. This was the bedrock, she thought. This was the bottom of the lunar rabbit hole, not the hotel room, not the airport. She scolded herself for thinking he'd been anything more than a guy who had taken an opportunity. Of course, there would be nothing more to follow. And what had she wanted from it anyway? She tried to focus on lowering her heart rate through breathing, but failed. Patella plateau, she thought. Pleasure, pain, dopamine. Dopamine. She recalled from some undergrad microbiology class the dopamine surges of the brain, and that the pull of feelings of pleasure and pain were regulated by the same chemicals and the same processes. It meant she had done nothing wrong. If Mark was sitting in a cubicle next to her or on her lunch schedule somewhere out in the city where they would see each other regularly, rather than halfway across the country in Minneapolis, he would likely feel the same things that compelled him just a few weeks prior to devote after a few drinks. Dopamine would again surge in his brain, and again she would appear attracted to him, maybe so much so that things would continue along very nicely and they'd have a time of it. Susie rested her head against her knees. Someone walked into the restroom. "Susie, is that you?" Simone. God, no, everyone would know she'd been sitting on the bathroom floor. She stood up, shielded from Simone by just 2 feet and a metal door. "I'm fine." "All right, just checking. I saw you run out of the pit." The pit, that's exactly what it was. She hated this place, hated Simone, hated selling fucking microphones. That night, Susie took out her conference notebook. She tore out the page where she'd written 4 o'clock auditorium Mark, crumpled it up and threw it away. Then she settled into bed, side-lying and spent, her feet pointed toward her husband's, each accusing the other, barely touching. She couldn't count all the ways that loss could be quantified between them, but she knew their mass, felt it shift around the empty rooms of her home. She stared at his head. She thought. She'd not noticed the round, thin patch of hair at the crown of his head. Just that night, she'd read an article about male baldness, revealing the phenomenon to be a mere case of forgetful cells, their memory for replicating, somehow forgotten. She made a note to relay the specifics of the article in the morning, after coffee, and before eggs.